Bonjour, hello, I'm Isabelle Foisy and I'm the president and founder of Point Cardinal. And today I am with.
Tasha Richard, and I'm an expert advisor with Point Cardinal.
And now, welcome to our latest podcast episode where we'll be talking about how English companies, need to focus and how they can do business in Quebec. And so, I'm a French Canadian bilingual person, and Tasha, you're an English speaking person that is also bilingual coming from Nova Scotia. So, you'll have two different perspectives on linguistic, but also on the cultural differences that is unique in Quebec, but also how you, as a company that is out of Quebec, can have a better inside view of maybe things that you need to consider or things that you need to avoid. And so, in that particular case, well, how about Tasha? You start us off on what you think, what you've seen in the past of challenges that English companies have or what they face when they're doing business in Quebec, and how maybe they've overcome these challenges.
Great. That's a really great question. I think it's a really important topic that actually doesn't get talked enough about when we're making strategic plans for organizations. And so perhaps I'll give you a little bit of context first. So I lived in Montreal for 10 years. I started my career there after finishing my MBA at McGill. And I was with Johnson Johnson. And this was early in my career, so I'm going to age myself, but that was, at least 20 years ago, if I did the math. What was really impressive to me is J&J already knew that when you're wanting to do business in Quebec and you're wanting to be successful, whether it's a product or a service that you have to have a different strategic plan. You have to have a different strategic marketing plan. And since my early days with J&J, I've then worked with a series of companies that have had a lot of success in the Quebec market. But I've also worked with companies that have not had a lot of success and have actually pulled their product out of the marketplace because they didn't succeed. And so I think it's a really important topic that we talk about because I think there's some really easy ways for predominantly English companies to enter the Quebec marketplace, to put a good plan in place to be successful. And I think so the first thing I want to say is you have to recognize that doing business in Quebec is different than doing business elsewhere. It's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. And so once you actually recognize that exists, then you can say, okay, how do we need to either completely change what we're doing from a strategic marketing perspective or just a strategic perspective, and what can we do the same? And so having the second point I want to make is having experts to help you help advise you along this journey is really, really critical. And so when I look at the success of the companies that I worked with that had success in Quebec,
Mhm.
it was because they did engage local experts in the development of their plan. That's really, really important. And I think one of the other things that's really important to think about is an understanding is the deep cultural, beautiful heritage that the province of Quebec can offer. And I just remember when I was with Johnson and Johnson, we had a lot of Hollywood actresses. I mean, it was predominantly female at that point that we would engage in different advertisements. And so when we went to translate these advertisements into French, it wasn't just saying, okay, let's try to get these Hollywood actresses to speak French. We said, okay, we need to move completely away from that talent and look for local talent. And my goodness, it was a tough job only because there was so much amazing talent in Quebec. It's almost like you have your own little Hollywood. Would you agree with that?
I'd say that yes, of course. And even when you're talking about celebrities that are out of Quebec,
Yeah.
sometimes there's no reference. I
No.
remember being at the general at the conference with the general
Perfect.
leadership
Level.
conference, and
Yep.
people that are coming up and I knew nothing about. Not that I don't think I'm culturally inefficient, but of course there are differences, and I would say the same thing for companies that are in Quebec wanting to go to the rest of Canada. They also need to think about it differently as well. And so I don't think it's only when you're coming to Quebec. I think it's also when you're in Quebec and going elsewhere. I think you need to think about it as an exportation. How you do the cultural ways of doing is different in Quebec, but same thing if you're going to Mexico, if you're going to the States, if you're going anywhere else. But I think that sometimes you put it aside or you don't think it's as important as it is as you when you think about it when you're exporting out of Canada. I think that at some point as well that the cultural differences might be different in Quebec as well. Yeah, I agree
Mm.
with that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that companies need to recognize and embrace is that it's going to take money, right? So if you're going to have a campaign for English speaking Canada that works coast to coast for the most part, that's great. But then you have to save some of your budget in order to do executions in Quebec. It is going to cost money. It is going to be more effort in some situations, but the payback, the return is there, particularly in a couple of key industries that Quebec has really invested in. So the technology industry, I would say the food industry, those are really popular and growing industries in Quebec. And I think, I would say in the early 2000s, there may have been a lot of head offices, English speaking head offices that moved out of Quebec
Mm.
and potentially to Toronto or to, the outskirts of Toronto. But now I think we're starting to see a move back, and it's really exciting for me to see. I loved my time there. I think there's a lot to offer in a city, particularly in Montreal, that's growing so quickly. So, or starting to grow quickly, I should say again, and investing in its infrastructure. And then the other thing I was going to mention is certainly there's the legalities, right? And we're not legal experts. I'm not a legal expert. You might be.
But we have legal experts in the team,
We
right? So I
do.
think,
We
yeah.
do. Yeah, but there's legalities, especially around language, that you have to consider. And it's not just taking Google Translate and taking what you have. When we saw that recently, do you remember I sent you a social media post? I won't name the company, I won't call them out, but there was a very big company that should have known better that took their slogan in English, and I
And
swear to goodness,
translate
they
in
must have
French.
used a Google Translate, and they translated French. It flopped. It did not work, right? And
Mm.
so it is there's so many nuances to Quebecois French from my perspective. You do yourself a disservice if you don't hire someone from Quebec that understands the nuances, that understands the I don't know how you say it, but like the just like the nuances of a language, right? So the slang that we use in English does not translate, right? And sometimes it can be offensive.
And I think
So
the great part of it is that we also have people like you that are from the English speaking provinces in Quebec and that are able to relate one side and the other. And I think this is the communication that needs to be done is the better understanding where we're coming from and where you're going. And if you really want to invest and this is a market that you want to develop, well, I think to get in touch with people that understand really the market makes a lot of sense.
Very. And I know that one company I was doing a strat plan for, well, it's 4 years ago now. They were looking at, so they were based here in Nova Scotia. They were in the food industry.
Mm.
They brought on a major player and an investor who wanted to expand. It was in the vertical farming space, vertical indoor farming. And so one of my jobs for them was to do uh, a situational analysis on where should be their next expansion farm. And these are very high tech farms. And one of the things, so we looked at all the different markets. I came up with a plan, and Quebec was the top of the list. And I'll tell you why, because the government right now is heavily investing in, as I mentioned, a couple of different sectors. There's a lot of I do research on entrepreneurial ecosystems. So
Mm.
the entrepreneurial ecosystem for Quebec is really strong. There's a lot of different support programs in place, both at the federal, sorry, at the provincial level, but also in the municipal level. Um, and if you're a company that depends heavily on infrastructure or on natural resources, I mean, the price of power in Quebec versus the rest of Canada is pretty darn cheap.
Mm.
And it's a green source of energy. So any industry that really relies heavily on energy, Quebec is a really, really interesting marketplace for you to be looking at. So I just wanted to make sure before I forgot that I got that in there. Um, and just back to the language for one moment, because I've also seen companies that have used a Parisian French. And so I think
It's not
what
the
you
same, right?
it's
It's not the
not
same, and
the
it's like
same.
I would do the parallel bill if you're in Canada and you have someone speaking, I don't know, Australian English. Well, it would
Right.
make no sense for you to refer it as being someone in Quebec or in Canada. Same thing if you're asking a doubling the voices with Parisian French or
Yeah.
utilizing Parisian French in writing.
Yeah.
Well, you're not going to be relating as well, and so
Yeah.
it's as if you don't know the market in which you're going to. So same thing, the parallel makes sense as well if you're talking about Australian English or
Yeah.
American English, or if you're parallel with different other Englishes that you have, British English, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so make sure that you're using Quebecois French and not Parisian French or France French because it is different for sure. I wanted to ask you a question.
Yeah.
We didn't prepare for this, but I think your expertise and your experiences in working with businesses and your involvement with the Chamber of Commerce, what are you seeing in terms of Quebec's focus or investment in bringing more English speaking companies to Quebec? Have you seen this in the work that you've done?
Yeah, well, we've seen a lot of, yes, English speaking, but not necessarily across Canada. It could be from states. It can be, there's a lot
Right.
of new companies coming aboard. I think that you talked about the energy, but also about the capacity of innovation that is, we can see as well in Quebec. We also see grants and subsidies that are also really important. You talked a little bit about that a little earlier on, but I think that we're a great place for us to work. And I think that we're cool to work with. I think it's a cool place to be. I think it's also a great, to have the balance between work and life balance. I think that is something that you can bring aboard with your teams, with your employees, and I think it is a focus that is sometimes put aside. But I think that Montreal and Quebec is also recognized for, being outdoorsy, being, the cultural part of it, food, eating well, family, friends, and all this is also something that you get as a vibe within the Quebec market that is also really attracting talent, but is maintaining talent in place as well. And if you're thinking about coming to Quebec, I think those are a lot of the things that we're hearing from companies that are being here for a few years now. That they're finding that it is keeping their people in place here in the province.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think so. We talk about companies that might be considering Quebec, but if you're also in the situation you're listening to this that you are predominantly an English speaking organization, you may be new to Quebec, maybe you've been here for a couple of years and you're struggling, reach out because it's not just new companies that are coming to Quebec that we like to work with, but it's also those that are already here and that might need a little bit of help with their specific strategic plan as it relates to Quebec. So there's those two things. The
And if
other
you
thing,
give me
yeah,
just yes, Tasha, I'll also say
yeah,
that it's important as well to know that we're able to mix people together as well. So talking about companies that are already here that have had this challenge in the past, well, we don't hesitate to put these CEOs together and having lunch together and talking about what the experience is. So it's not only about doing a strat plan, but making
yeah,
sure that we're getting connections out there and that we're putting people together that are able to step a few steps ahead and making sure that we're not repeating maybe things that have been done maybe differently or that
right.
maybe should be done in another way.
Right. No, that's a great point. And I know when we were originally talking about this podcast topic, one of the things that we struggled with a little bit was referring to it as English speaking Quebec and French speaking Quebec because it's not like there's like this divide. There's two different clubs, there's two different sides of the street, right? So we're using these words only because it helps identify those that are non-Quebec founded or non, didn't weren't born in Quebec in terms of the company, but are looking to bring their organization to Quebec. So,
And with
you
now
know,
with internet and the numerization, I think it's like across the board, right? So I think it's a new way of doing business, and it's just to get engaged quickly
yeah,
on a discussion and making sure that we're not taking this as it's impossible to do. It's just to have
yeah,
a discussion and to bring the companies to understanding that this is a really interesting market and that
yeah,
to skip this market might be a way for them to avoid making business, right? So don't go ahead and just don't skip Quebec. Make sure that you
Yeah.
come to Quebec and that we're able to have this discussion around what it makes, how it makes sense. And now that you can, work across different provinces, across different countries, well, I think it's important that you consider Quebec as a place to come.
Yeah. And to come in terms of launching your product or service, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a home base in Quebec. Certainly I've worked with several organizations very successfully that haven't had an office per se in Quebec, but they've been able to launch their product or service in Quebec. And so that, I just wanted to make sure we like our listeners understood that it doesn't certainly it would be great to have a head office there. And at some point you may want to do that. But as your business is growing, it may not make sense initially, and it's still okay to launch. But again, it's the same thought process. It has to be very well planned out and executed. And that brings up another point I wanted to make, Isabel, around market research.
Mm,
And so certainly another key to success before you launch into the Quebec marketplace is making sure you do invest in market research to really understand what it means for your product, your service, the industry that you're in. How can you succeed in the market? And what kind of reception will your potential customers have to you, for you or with you, sorry, with your product or service? And so making sure you set aside the money to do that, you set aside the time to do that, you bring in the experts you need to execute the market research, and that is really going to help set up your company for success as you launch. And so again, it comes back to the visuals and to the words and even your packaging. What you think might resonate with Quebec, the Quebecois may not, right? And so you have to be able to take the time, do the market research, and then come up with the plan.
Yeah, it's rarely cut and paste, right? So, and the same
No.
thing for people in Quebec wanting to do business in Canada, it's rarely cut and paste because the references are different, because the market research is different, because it is different, and it's not good or bad, it's just different, right? So I think it needs to be put there. And maybe something as well, I'd like to hear you about, have you seen companies that, we talked about companies that did not so well at some point? Do you have
Yeah.
examples of companies that really did it well?
Yeah, absolutely. And probably more, I would say maybe it's equal, 50-50 in terms of who did it well and who didn't. And the ones that did it well, I think that they first of all knew what their product and service offering was. So they already had a really good understanding of their company, of their expertise, before they went into the Quebec market. They definitely recognized the investment that it took. They brought on a local firm, such as Point Cardinal, to help them with that transition or that launch within the Quebec marketplace. And I think they also understood that it takes time, because at the end of the day, I don't care what business or industry you're in, it's about relationships. And
Mm.
so it takes time to build relationships. And sometimes I think when there may be a, a, a language barrier, it may take even longer. And
Mm.
and if your company isn't known in Quebec, your brand isn't known, if it's brand new and it doesn't have a strong reputation, then naturally whomever you're dealing with has to be able to trust you. It has to build credibility with them. And so I think it also takes patience. And as with any new market, it's rarely an overnight success. And so when I reflect on the companies that have had that great success, and I'm thinking of a couple that went into their food companies, that were able to get really broad retail distribution, so come in Metro or Jean Coutu, or wherever it is that they wanted to be. They were in it. They had to demonstrate that they were in it for the long haul, that they were willing to, like when you go and sit down with Metro as an example,
Mm.
they want to know what is your marketing plan for Quebec, and how is it different, and what talent are you going to use, and what kind of investment have you made in terms of understanding the different languages and the
And the
nuances. So
community involvement and making sure,
yes,
that the company is not just there for a hit and run, right? Just come in and
Totally.
go out. So wanting to understand as well, they're talking about the plan. What is the plan and how long will you be there and what do you think you'll need to invest in, and to feel that the company is also investing in the province, not only in the product. So
Right.
it's so it's two different things. And I'd like to add to what we were saying as a
Mm.
discussion, in Quebec as well. I think the startup ecosystem is like so great, and it's like in evolution all the time, and we have these incubators and accelerators in Quebec that are really doing a great job. And so a lot of these businesses are emerging, and you need to tap into these emerging companies as well, and to understand how you can relate with them. Maybe your company can help one of these startups, or maybe you're a startup and you want to start your business in the Quebec market because of the schools, and because of all this effervescent around the ecosystem in the startup mode in Quebec.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's definitely an exciting time to be an entrepreneur in Quebec or outside of Quebec, looking at coming to Quebec. So, and potentially, maybe what we can do is post some resources along with this podcast
Good idea.
on some,
Yep.
yeah, on some great links that folks might want to check out. Have we missed anything, Isabel? Is there anything that we need to add to this conversation? Any other questions that we haven't tackled yet? It's such an exciting and fun topic.
I know. Well, maybe no. You know what we should add? If people have questions or comments, or
Yeah,
if they
that's a good
want to
idea.
pursue the discussion, I think it would be perfect for them
Yeah,
to ask us, and to maybe we'll do a second podcast on this
yeah,
subject
great.
with the topics that we'll hear from our auditors.
That's great. Love it.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Tasha, again, and hopefully we'll stuck together again on this topic or other topics that interest our speakers, and not their
I'm sure we
speakers,
will.
but the people that are listening to us.
Yes, our
Okay,
listeners.
our
Love it.
listeners. Yeah, thank you so much. Bye
Thank
bye.
you.